Hello, everyone, and happy Thursday. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Jamie Henkel. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Learning and Inclusion Manager at pflagnation.al. Just like every week, I'm going to bring in my teammate, Jean Marie Nevada, to lead today's conversation.
Hey, Jamie Henkel.
Jean Marie, how are you?
I'm doing well. Even though we're having a conversation about something that inherently intimidates me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's such an important conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing from both of our guests today.
Yes. Thank you for getting us started. Maybe we'll see you a little bit later.
Okay.
Hey, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at pflagnation.al, and my pronouns are she and ella. Every single week, we get together to talk about something related to LGBTQ equality and inclusion. And this week, we are talking about online harassment and bullying, which is why I said I'm a little bit intimidated by today's conversation. So before we get started, for those of you who want to read this week's article, we have a great one that was on NBC News from Joe Yucaba. And it was called "After Don't Say Gay Bill Passed, Anti-LGBTQ Grooming Rhetoric Surged 400% Online." And let me give you just a couple of the top line findings from that particular article. So after the passage of the Florida bill, we saw a 400% increase in harassment online. There were about 989,000 tweets that actually included the term groomer, which prior to that had not necessarily reared its head as much in the social media space as it used to. Interestingly enough, the article also points to the presence of a very small handful, under 10 people, of high-profile individuals, including a few elected leaders, whose tweets involving this language were actually viewed over 48 million times. So while the people doing this tend to be kind of limited, the reach for it is incredibly extensive, and the impact of that really can be terrible. So once again, if you want to read that article, you want to check out straightforequality.org/discussion series, and you can grab that great NBC article today and read that yourself. And today's conversation, we're going to break into two pieces. We want to talk about what's happening, and we want to talk about a little bit about what people need to do about it. So to talk about what's happening and why this is happening, we have our colleague Ari Drennan, who's the LGBTQ plus program manager at Media Matters for America.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Hey, Ari, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it because the work that's happening at Media Matters is so good, and I just think you're kind of the perfect fit to help us understand what's going on. So before we get into a conversation about exactly what's happening, for people who are not familiar with Media Matters, can you tell people a little bit about what it is, what you do, and how to find out more?
Yeah, of course. So Media Matters is a progressive watchdog organization, and my team within the organization focuses specifically on disinformation and extremism around LGBTQ plus people and the ways in which those proliferate, both through the mainstream media, through social media, and through the various, parts of the right-wing media.
Which means you basically never get to take a vacation ever, is what I'm thinking.
Oh, I get vacation. It's very important to unplug and have some time to. I hike a lot, so
far away from the internet.
Yeah, it's very important to touch grass.
It really is. So, hate has always had a place on the internet. That's no big surprise to anyone. But lately, it seems like it's more prominent. It's definitely more extreme. And it seems like it's being really amplified people with some significant power. We pointed to some elected individuals, people who have really big media footprints. So to you, what is behind this spike? I mean, this particular article pointed to the passage of anti-LGBT legislation in Florida, but I'm guessing it's a little bit more complicated than that.
It is a little bit more complicated than that. So we've been tracking a spike in LGBTQ people being accused of grooming and of being a threat to children. That's really spread throughout the year. Earlier on in the year, we identified the Twitter account Libs of TikTok as the biggest driver of this conversation on Twitter, which is, where a lot of elected officials and journalists and activists spend a lot of time. That and sorry, just to be clear, that account helped jumpstart this conversation long before "Don't Say Gay" was even under discussion. And Ron DeSantis's then press secretary, Christina Pushaw, credited libs of TikTok with, quote unquote, opening her eyes to what she said was going on that necessitated the passing of this bill.
Wow. So we do have a lot of people out there kind of approaching this differently. And it's a little bit scary when an account like that we discover is informing the opinions of support staff for elected leaders. So one of the things I found interesting is the language that is actually being used. We have seen the term groomers appear. In fact, the press secretary actually, I believe, mentioned that word specifically. And some of this language has not been in the mainstream for a very long time. There was a time where I think this was really prominent. We went past that, and then suddenly it made this really intense and what seemed to be a really quick comeback. What do you think is behind the path of the use of this kind of language? Because it seems to have come out of nowhere. A term that was pretty dead for a long time is suddenly back and being used by people who probably didn't even know the historic context.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been pretty horrifying to watch, honestly. Just a few years ago, this kind of language was pretty much confined to places like 4chan and other dark corners of the internet. If you look back a couple years, the Fox News host Laura Ingraham was using this term in reference to drag queen story hours and saying that they were a threat to children. But it was really just her, even on that network, who was calling attention to this and saying that this was a problem. So there's been a huge uptick in anti-LGBTQ hate and language during the Biden administration. And something that I think is really important to keep in mind is that it's a backlash to success. This is happening because extremists on the internet are recognizing that LGBTQ identities are becoming normalized and accepted, and that they're pulling out all the stops to try to push a whole generation back into the closet. And they're doing that because they've already lost.
I think that's such an interesting point. And I've heard a few people make that comment that the battle that we're seeing is probably the most vicious battle because it is right before people officially need to kind of declare that they've been defeated, that their point did not hold water. So groomers is one of the ones that I think I've seen popping up a lot. Are there other terms that people should be paying attention to? I know that Libs of TikTok has certainly inspired all different kinds of conversations and all different kinds of language. But are there other words that are emerging that I think people that maybe seem a little bit benign, but people should be aware that they're coming from a place of real bias?
That's a really good question. I think I haven't focused as much on specific words as so much as trends and online discussions about queer people. A thing that I think is really important to name and to track is the way that these conversations have progressed from conversations about trans people's participation in sports and the idea that, people have argued that they're trying to protect sports for, cis women and girls by excluding trans people. And then a lot of those same conversations have followed a progression from there where, first they're arguing against trans people in sports, then they're arguing against trans people in bathrooms or other spaces like that. And then all of a sudden they're saying like, you can't say that you have a same-sex spouse in your school. And, this is a very studied and intentional ladder of radicalization where they focus first on the issue of sports to try to get people on their side because they have research that show that this is the way to get people to be sympathetic to anti-LGBTQ campaigns. And then they progress from there and get increasingly more extreme. And that's how you get a progression of an account like Libs of TikTok, which, started by calling attention to, kind of weird, uncomfortable situations in classrooms that teachers were describing, and has slowly progressed from there to, calling in right-wing extremists against pride events, and more recently leading to violent threats against hospitals that are providing gender-affirming care for trans people, and using a lot of really, charged language there about mutilation and about the healthcare that is life-saving for so many people.
I think that is such a good point. I think that you're right. Sports has provided an entry point that I think a lot of people were able to jump on really quickly, and it has escalated. I think that it creates a norm around that dialogue. And then as it gets more intense, it's sort of like the very slow boil. You don't even realize it's happening until we are in a really scary, ugly place. And the example against the hospitals is a really great one. So fighting bad messaging, fighting bad language, fighting these efforts is definitely not easy. And I think there are a lot of people who are really uncomfortable with the idea of letting this misinformation just exist unchecked. And yet getting into this can be very frightening. And we've seen lots of examples of where people have challenged, and it has resulted in actual violence. It has resulted in actual threats. It has resulted in doxing. What kind of suggestions do you make to people who are seeing this kind of content? Do you suggest to them that they absolutely disengage from these places? Or is there something they should be doing? Or are there conversations that we should be initiating maybe while these are happening, so we're doing more education around it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the best counter to the idea that LGBTQ people are, some kind of threat is just the normalization of our lives. I'm a trans woman and I go about my day just like anybody else, doing my laundry, running errands, like all the really basic mundane stuff that has to do with daily living. And so I think that I still believe that most people are good and accepting. I couldn't have gone through what I've gone through without having that perspective. And so I think the best way to break down the kind of silos of fear that people get into is just to interact with them on a human level. So the flip side of that is that I think, a lot of times social media works to dehumanize people and push them into silos. And so it's often not really worth the trouble involved to get into debunking and, getting into some back and forth with someone whose entire monetary stream depends on keeping people scared of queer people. So, it is important to explain, I think, to professional journalists and media organizations why it's irresponsible to platform somebody who's promoting these slanders. But, you're not going to stop the people doing so from doing so. And unfortunately, that's just something that we have to kind of coexist with while understanding that, I think most people are accepting and kind.
I really appreciate you saying that. And the more we go through this time, the more I keep finding myself saying, let's elevate the good actors. Let's give platform to the good actors, because there really are so many good people out there, especially in the face of ugliness like this. So I really, really appreciate you saying that. Well, Ari, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your insight on this. If people want to check out Media Matters, we've got their website. We've been scrolling it. We're going to have it on there it goes again, MediaMatters.org. Make sure you're checking out their work, subscribe to some of their newsletters, and follow them on social. They do really great work. And Ari, thank you for being with us, and thanks for everything that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you for the work that you do too. I really appreciate it, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. Well, next up, I'd like to bring in another colleague. Every now and then we have one of our topics where I realize one of my colleagues at PFLAG, it would be a perfect addition to this conversation, and today is just one of those days. So to talk about what we can do about this, delving in a little bit deeper into how we respond in these situations, I'd like to bring in my colleague, PFLAG social media and digital content manager, Greg Rakiski. Hey, Greg.
Hello, Jean Marie. How are you?
I'm good, especially because you haven't forced me to use TikTok lately. So I'm really super good. And I'm sure you're better for it too.
Never.
How many takes can it take for me to provide 7 seconds of content? The answer is countless. So Greg, getting much more serious about this stuff. The article that we read this week really emphasized how very ugly it has gotten online. And you probably spend more time online checking this out than almost anybody that I know. So have you seen a spike in what this article was describing in our own PFLAG universe, and sort of how has it played out for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the short answer is yes, unfortunately. Even as it relates to PFLAG National's content, specifically, I think Twitter, we've definitely seen an uptick where some of our posts and content have been co-opted, unfortunately. And it's very easy to tell when that happens because it is very similar messaging and it happens in a burst of time. And a burst of time could be a few hours or a couple days. And so it has been hard, seeing that and seeing how concerted an effort. One of the things that stood out to me in the report is that there's no one cause, but it is clearly a vocal minority of people with extreme reach that people are hearing and believing and sharing this mis and disinformation so vehemently, forcefully, and quickly in succession. And so we have seen definitely from this, but I think I loved what Ari said, that the majority of people are good-willed. And so I see this as an opportunity for organizations like Media Matters and PFLAG to be even more critical in the digital space. So while yes, unfortunately, I think the longer answer is it just is so much more important for the good and the joy of our stories to be told.
Yeah, and have you noticed, because this article really tied some of those political developments with real spikes and ebbs and sort of in this, have you also seen that happening too, that as certain stories emerge that we are seeing more pushback or conversely more positive chatter?
Yeah, I think it's been complicated is the short answer. To Ari's point, I think it was happening before Florida's Don't Say Gay bill. I think we have seen with every spike in anti-LGBTQ plus legislation and political kind of attacks, it has only grown the wave. So every time, a year ago, right, we would maybe get hit here and there with a few folks. And I think as this momentum is growing, as these predominantly anti-LGBTQ plus mis and disinformation spreaders are growing in popularity, unfortunately, I think it is apparent when we have these kind of spikes on our end in the volume of people weighing in. So every attack, unfortunately, and I think the point here is still that at the same time, it's in the comment section, it is in the replies. Unfortunately, having worked in social media and not my first rodeo in being exposed to this, I'm still smiling as a part of this episode, is also seeing, to your point, that spike in joy affirmation on broader content. And so I think what's important for us to think about here is how do we keep these small sparks um, uh, kind of controlled in a vacuum so that our stories really are the ones that are spreading rather than this mis and disinformation.
I love that point. And I have to admit, even as we were planning this show, there was a part of me that thought, do we even want to give the airtime and the oxygen to the people who are doing this? And I think as we went back and forth, we all agreed, well, we don't want to do that. We do need to have a conversation so people understand what's happening and also how they can respond. But it is not an easy, you're right. It's a very complicated conversation, even how we talk about the conversation. So, one of the things, I found interesting in this week's article, and I actually wrote it down. So, the researchers who did the particular report that the article covered said that they used the report and issue feature on Twitter, and 99% of the 100 tweets that they had flagged were completely ignored. They continued to make it out there. Only one of 59 ads was removed from Facebook of the 59 that were actually reported. Meanwhile, Facebook notably made $25,000 off of the ads that those researchers were looking at. So as we look at how do we respond to this, I think the response, and you've talked about this before, comes at a lot of different levels. It's not one strategy. What do you think is going on with the platforms that host this, that these big companies should be doing? Because it looks like that while there's things in place, those things are not really working.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that we need to understand and advocate for these companies to do is not just have the feature, but actually utilize it. I think we're seeing a lot of the automation or just
Yeah.
human error or just blatant disregard for the anti-LGBTQ plus messaging rooted in science and in clear violation of policies and standards being ignored, while we have these predominant money-making accounts that are in clear violation of standards. And I will say from my experience personally as a social media manager, those reports do often get ignored or rejected. And so I think there's so many different pieces of this. To your point, like we could talk from a organizational perspective. So how do we keep PFLAG National's
Right.
content safe? That's a whole different conversation. But I think what we also do as a individual is make sure that our voices are heard by these companies of better advocacy reporting policies to keep all marginalized communities safe. And it can't be about the money grab for these advertisers. We really have to make sure that these spaces, because I truly believe at the end of the day that social media is a wonderful place and it has
I
connected
agree.
marginalized communities in so many different ways and allowing voices and perspectives and commonality to be shared. But we also have to hold these tech companies and social media companies accountable.
Yeah. And you know what? I think especially as we go into election season, this is going to become an even bigger issue. I mean, I think we saw how it played out in the last election. And I think with more sophistication, more organizing, and there certainly has been a lot, we are in for a very, very bumpy few months ahead of us. So if somebody says to you, as somebody who really knows what to do and what not to do and what tends to work, I want to start responding to these people. I have seen this post. I've seen them using this language. I want to respond. How do you typically counsel people? Is that even worth your time? Is it not worth your time? Are you potentially subjecting yourself to harassment? How do you kind of coach around that? Because I do understand this need to, you shouldn't just be allowed to say that and get away with it.
Absolutely. I think Ari had a great point of not giving so much airtime and breathing room to these clearly extremist respondents. And so I think I'll speak from kind of a social media manager perspective, and then I'll speak from an everyday citizen, as that's probably like there could be a choose your own adventure of how much you want to show up as an ally in these digital spaces. Because if you're not doing this day to day, I think kind of mental health and self care can be a whole an additional part of this conversation. So I think part of it is understanding if you're finding that a piece of content is being overtaken in replies or comments by extremists, it likely is not, if you're just an individual, worth your mental capacity to jump in there and try to change their mind. I think what you need to do is educate yourself on what the other side and is being distributed in the mis and dis and malinformation. So understand what that messaging is. And to Ari's point, have conversations with your neighbors, your family members, your coworkers about how to combat this. So then hopefully they're not posting or sharing or engaging intentionally or unintentionally, right? I think an awareness of all of this content overload, being careful about what we share and the messaging that we quickly or haphazardly might uplift or amplify unwillingly or unknowingly sometimes. And so I would not waste your time as an individual in the content section. And even from a social media manager, when I see this rumbling happening, I quickly turn off comments after I put a reply of a credible news article based in science and facts, so that anyone else seeing that content have a reliable source there in the comments or replies. And then I'll just turn it off outside of PFLAG responding, because it's just not worth it. I'll try to hide any blatantly violent responses after reporting them, so it still is a relatively safe space as much as I can control as a social media manager. And so I think that's, if you're managing accounts for organizations or whatnot, that is definitely something I would recommend. And as an individual, understanding what they're saying, having a sense of the messaging, and being okay with stepping away and having meaningful conversations as allies elsewhere.
Yeah. First of all, I absolutely love the fact that you just made that connection that I think a lot of people don't do, which is get offline at times and have those real world conversations, because the neighbor who you're also friends with on Facebook is standing in the yard and you could be having a much more effective conversation with them. I think we need to remember that. And I also think you made a great point. There are people who post things very unknowingly. thinking that this is a good piece of information, thinking this is going to start a helpful conversation. I think not necessarily going right to the attack with them and actually doing that education, because that could be that fine line between validating a stereotype of a person like you versus sort of changing the way people perceive each other. So you actually did mention self-care, which is what I want to spend the remainder of our time on. I will admit that I am one of those people, and I know that I am not alone, who at various assorted times has completely pulled out of social media, like not gone near my Facebook account for months on end, barely touched Twitter, and we won't even go past that. That has been the way I felt compelled to self-care, because sometimes this has seemed a little bit too intense to me. But that's not also a good solution either, because I did disconnect myself from networks. I did disconnect myself from people, and I also didn't contribute to positive conversations. What kind of suggestions for self-care do you have for people who are spending time in there? And I know it looks a little different for everybody, but sort of big picture things. And I'd love to hear about some of the stuff that works for you, because I've read a lot about people who by profession spend time on social media a lot, and y'all get beat up badly.
Yeah,
What do you do? Because this really, and very honestly, it's something I have not mastered yet.
Yeah, I think it's definitely hard, especially for people like you and me and others who really want to be a part of the connection, being a part of the solution, but also recognizing that, as the report talked about, is this is so complicated because there's not one root source. And
Yeah.
there's so much dis and malinformation being spread on various topics, even outside of the LGBTQ plus community. So I love talking about this. I think one of the important things is knowing yourself at a very high level. So if you're someone who really needs to unplug and cannot be in this all the time, and you know yourself, I would definitely not recommend volunteering for orgs or board member roles, right? Like I'm involved with several other organizations, and I'm always willing to volunteer for social media or digital roles because I'm very comfortable in doing that in my day-to-day life. If that's not the case, make sure that you are setting up people for success. Have those candid conversations for volunteer roles. If it is involved in the digital space, that they understand what the landscape is, what they're stepping into, and that self-care is critical. And I'll talk kind of my things that I do to make sure I do stay sane, or as sane as I possibly can, in the day-to-day of all of this happening. But understanding that, so don't surround yourself or put yourself in situations where you have to be on, even when your energy is low. That's the first step. And then as a level further, like if you're looking as a civilian and you just want to understand about how I can contribute positively, I don't think the time well spent is on the comment section. I think there is a reason why there is this funny colloquialism, maybe not funny, but like avoid the comment section. If we know that, people often on either side are weighing in there and they're not actually absorbing anything. So I would say spend your time on finding those stories, vet them for mis and disinformation, make sure they are concrete and sound, and celebrate normalizing the humans of all marginalized communities. So if we're talking about just showing trans and non-binary joy, showing queer joy, uplift those stories primarily. So that's what people are seeing, knowing that many of us are probably not spending too much time in the comment section outside of trying to have a combat war that is probably futile. So I would say that's another thing. Spend some time vetting the meaningful type of content that will actually help further truth as well as joy and affirmation. And then in terms of knowing when to, if you're committed to being in the digital spaces, know when to pull back and know when to go in. I will try and build out at least part of the day, knowing I do this for my job, to be inside a book, even if it's my Kindle without notifications, knowing that however possible that we can't take it so personally sometimes when we see things outside of our sphere. So let's remember what we can control, have those conversations, be aware of the issue, and know that we're contributing in different ways that is pushing progress forward. So I think it's like you said, there's no one size fits all, but we have to build in time to unplug. We have to remember that these are a vocal minority causing these issues. And I do believe at the end of the day, we'll be better down the road. It'll just be tough for us.
I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate the dig into the good stuff because I think there is so much good news. I got to the point where I actually started Googling the term good news, like with various things I care about. And you see these articles and it does kind of make you realize it doesn't all have to be doom and gloom all the time. And you have an opportunity to get that out there. So Greg, thank you so much. Perhaps I will make a triumphant return to social someday, but it's going to take a lot of hand holding. But thank you for being with us.
We'll be here. Thanks, Jean Marie.
I'll see you later, Greg. Well, everybody, that gets us to the end of another show. We'll be back again with another topic next week. You definitely want to join us. Quick reminder, if you want to be part of putting good things into the universe, you definitely want to check out PFLAG's Read with Love campaign. And you can learn more about that at pflag.org/readwithlove. We'll wrap up the same way we do every single week, reminding you, please take care of yourself, get vaccinations and boosters as necessary. And do those 3 really big things: run fast, laugh hard, and most of all, please be kind. We will see you next week on Something to Talk About Live. Bye, everybody.